All right, y'all, let's go ahead and get started. So here we are. I believe it's week 7, so we only have about 2.5 more weeks before the end of the first 9 weeks. And one of the big things you guys probably noticed over the course of the weekend, especially on Friday, is I went through and made sure that if you had turned any late work in, that I went back and graded it and updated grades, which meant that if you were missing an assignment and you have not turned it in, I finally got around to replacing that missing assignment with a 0. All right, and so some of y'all's grades took a hard nosedive as of Friday because of those missing assignments actually being put into the grade book as 0s. If you have quite a few 0s and you would like to repent for your sins and maybe work a way around making up those assignments, then you need to contact me. You need to send me a message and remind or an email saying, I messed up. I'm missing those assignments. They've been put in 0s. What can I do to replace those 0s, or what can I do to make up for that? Okay. Let's go ahead and take a look at our checklist for the week. And there are some things that we'll be doing this week that are not on those checklists because they're kind of weather dependent. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you guys. Okay. And let's take a look at what we've got going on. So you probably noticed this morning you got a bunch of alerts because a lot of the assignments have popped up for you. And so we're in unit 4. Oh, wait, no, we're in checklist. All right, so week 7, here we are. All right, so what do we have going on? Well, this week's a little different than prior weeks. We have our usual vocab, all right, for 4.2. That'll be due on Friday. I'm fine with that. But you do have your quiz on Wednesday this week, all right? And so, again, Wednesday is your asynchronous day, and so one of your primary responsibilities on Wednesday will be taking your 4.1 quiz, and that quiz takes a look at the first portion of the PowerPoints, right? About cells, the types of cells, and cell organelles, okay? And so I'll make sure to kind of point out which of those slides will be responsible for and which videos go along with the quiz on Wednesday. On Monday and Tuesday of this week, what we're really going to try to focus on is trying to get the vocab, the video, and the articles out of the way, because on Thursday and Friday, we're going to be doing our microscope lab and then planting our seeds in the garden. Okay, so you're not going to really have any class time for you guys Thursday, and for those of you at home on Friday, to be working on stuff during class, right? Because your Thursday and your Friday during the class period, we're going to be busy doing our lab, and that's going to take pretty much the whole period, okay? So if you want to make sure that you're not, doing assignments over the weekend or late at night, then you need to make sure really take advantage of these next 2 days and try to get the vocab, the article, and the video taken care of. Now, I do want to point out, and I'm going to go ahead and kind of put this in bold, the video this week is not just one video, it's actually 3 videos. Some of them are pretty small, and then some of them are about the usual length. And there's a reason why I'm having you guys look at the opioid crisis. It's something that's really, really important to me as an individual. And it's a very big problem in our country and our nation, right? And I think the key to reversing or stopping that crisis is understanding it. And it has a lot to do with cell transport, the way in which our cells interact with their environments. So I would not sit on that because there's 3 of them. It will take you a little bit longer than normal. All right. So big things, Wednesday there's quiz, and then again, Thursday and Friday. So when you're here on Thursday, you guys, we're going to be with our lab. So let's go ahead and get started for the day. And make sure to dress appropriately on Thursday and Friday. I will send out a reminder about the weather and just making sure that you don't wear your pretty white sneakers if we're out in the garden that day. All right, so we're going to start off today with some warm-up questions to kind of remind you about the vocabulary that you worked on last week. And I think some of you guys have already watched the videos and chipped away at the notes for Unit 4. If you guys would please join the Pear Deck we're going to take a look at 10 questions dealing with cells and cell organelles. And these questions and tomorrow's questions will better prepare you for your quiz on Wednesday. So we've got 22 students in here. So we should have 22 students connected. Now, correct me if I'm mistaken. You guys do learn a little bit about cells in middle school, right? The two main types of cells and a little bit about the cell organelles. All right, and as I had mentioned before, unit 4 is usually students' strongest unit. So don't sleep on this unit, right? Invest what you have in the past, and if you've done well in the past, you're gonna do even better during this unit. A little bit's like familiarity, and I think a lot of it is just the relative ease of the ideas of having an organelle and a specific function. Okay, is everyone waiting on one or two people? If you didn't get a chance to join, the code will be up in the corner, and you can simply type your answers into the private chat on Zoom because we do need to get started. Let me go ahead and click through to get to our questions for today. Okay, so take a moment. You guys have 9 questions. Do not need to use complete sentences. They can be one-word answers. Don't worry about spelling. See how many of these you can recall from memory. If this were your quiz today, how would you do? Let me go ahead and set a timer. I'll give you guys about 8 minutes, a little less than 60 seconds per question. I think that should be sufficient. And when you finish, if you would, under the participants tab in Zoom, if you'd click a little green check, so I can kind of get a count or a feel for how many of you guys are done. All right, give you another minute, and I'm gonna start. All right, let's go ahead and start going over these. If you didn't get to the question when I go over the answer, simply fill it in. So number one, what are some things that all cells have? Can anyone tell me one of the things that all cells have in common? Yeah, so they're all going to have DNA. If you remember from the very, very beginning of the class, it was one of the 8 characteristics of life, right? All living things are going to have DNA. And so every single cell is going to have its own set of DNA. Now, do you think there's going to be some exceptions to the rule? Yeah, but it's a pretty safe assumption to make that all cells are going to have DNA. On occasion, we will have cells, even in our bodies, that are still cells but lack DNA. And it's because they lose DNA as a part of their maturation or the way in which they specialize. A good example of a cell that actually lacks DNA, it's hard to do this because mirror image for me is, are your red blood cells, right? There's actually not a whole lot going on in a red blood cell. And it kind of makes sense if you think about what its function is, but we'll talk about that later. So DNA, all cells have DNA. What else? Yeah, ribosomes, right? And so ribosomes make proteins. And what protein or what type of protein helps catalyze reactions? Enzymes. And so all cells have a need for enzymes. And if you need enzymes, well, you need proteins and you need something to make those proteins. And so ribosomes are going to be found in all cells. Now, for those of you guys that paid particularly close attention during the videos, are all ribosomes the same? No, right? There is a fairly major distinction between the type of ribosomes, right? And we'll talk more about that later. But all cells have DNA, all cells have ribosomes. DNA is kind of like the instruction manual for proteins, and then ribosomes be the ones making the proteins. What else? What is the DNA and the ribosome going to be floating around in? The cytoplasm. And what separates the cytoplasm from the environment or the extracellular fluid? The cell membrane, right? So all cells are cells because they have a cell membrane. Inside of that cell membrane, you're going to have your jelly-like matrix, the cytoplasm, and embedded within that, you're going to find ribosomes and DNA. Now, number two, what type of cells or what type of cell lacks a nucleus and lacks membrane-bound organelles? Prokaryotic. Okay, so what I think about is I think prokaryote is the no karyote, right? And so I think of the cell, carrying around all this stuff, and prokaryotes are the no karyotes. They don't carry a lot inside of them. If you look at them with a compound light microscope, it doesn't really look like there's a whole lot going on inside, right? And so I think prokaryote is the no karyote. They lack a nucleus and they lack a membrane-bound organelles. Does anyone remember what we call the region in a prokaryote where we would find DNA? It's not a true nucleus, but it kind of sounds like nucleus. The nucleoid, yeah. So the nucleoid region of a prokaryote is an area where you would find DNA, right? And it kind of resembles, right, what could have one day become a nucleus, but it's not, okay? So prokaryotes, they do not have a nucleus. How else can we describe a prokaryotic cell? So no nucleus, no organelles. What about their size when we compare it to a eukaryote? They're going to be smaller, right? And we can tend to think of them as a simpler cell, right? Because they lack all that crazy organelle machinery inside. Number three, fungi, plants, animals, and protists. They would all be considered what because of the types of cells they have? Eukaryotic, right? So those are all eukaryotes. They belong to the domain eukarya, which simply means that their cells are eukaryotic, which means they contain a nucleus and membrane-bound organelles. So I think you are a eukaryote. So you are an animal and you have complex cells. I also think eukaryote is the eukaryote. So they do have a nucleus and they do have organelles. Now, what about bacteria and archaea? Prokaryotic, okay? And so an easy way that I came up with when I was a kid to remember is, I think prokaryote, problem bacteria. Bacteria tend to cause problems. Now, do they really? No, majority of bacteria are actually beneficial or mundane. They don't really bother us. But, bacteria does kind of have a bad rap, right, for causing problems like infections. So I think prokaryote, problem bacteria. Now, number four, what cell structure is found in all cells is responsible for protein synthesis? We talked a little bit about it already. Yeah, the ribosomes, the ribosomes, right? I like to, in my mind, I pronounce it ribosomes, and I think of ribs. And why does that help me remember? Because ribs are going to have a lot of what? They're meat, so they're going to have a lot of protein. And that's just a really goofy way for me to remember that, right? So ribosomes, protein synthesis. And we'll talk a lot about ribosomes later on. We talk about DNA transcription and translation. 5, what two organelles are thought to have arisen from an ancient endosymbiont? Yeah, the mitochondria and chloroplast, right? And so it's really wild. I remember when I was first learning about this, I thought, no way could a cell live inside of another cell. And then I stopped and I thought, well, wait a minute. What is covering every square inch of your body? You can find it in every fluid inside of you. It's all over your intestines. Bacteria, right? And so we have small single-celled organisms living inside of us as it is. So why is it so far-fetched to think that a cell could live inside of another cell? What happens when you get a bacterial infection? A lot of times the bacteria, the prokaryote, actually gets inside of your cell, right? Now, it doesn't live there permanently, right? Infects you and causes disease, or your immune system will take care of it. But the chloroplast and mitochondria are thought to have at one point been their own cell that simply endocytized or became a part of a much larger cell. Now, what kind of evidence do they have to support this theory? I mentioned it in the video. What do we find inside of the mitochondria and the chloroplast? Anyone remember? Every living thing is considered alive because it contains DNA. And so if the mitochondria and the chloroplasts were at one fact their own cell, they'd have to have what? Their own set of DNA. And they do, right? If we were to look at the mitochondria in your cells, we could find mitochondrial DNA. And here's a really neat fact about mitochondrial DNA. It all came from your mom. So if I were to look at your normal cell DNA in the nucleus, 50% of it belongs to your mom, the other 50% belongs to your dad, right? And we can trace that back to both sets of grandparents. But if we look at your mitochondrial DNA, it only matches your mother. Why might that be? What's that? Yeah, well, that's good. That's pretty. She said because well, my mom birthed me, right? And so yeah, right. But what cell did your mother contribute to you? The egg. And what cell did your father contribute? The sperm. And we haven't really looked at those cells yet, but I know that you guys have probably seen like cartoon diagrams of an egg cell and a sperm cell, and you've probably seen them side by side. Which one's larger? The egg, right? And you've seen the picture of the egg with like the thousands of sperm trying to get in through the cell membrane. Well, the egg contains all the organelles, whereas a sperm is kind of useless. It's just like a DNA delivery device, right? Here's some DNA, here's some genes, right? And so you inherited your mitochondria from your mother because they were already present in your egg. What's really neat about this, though, is because since it's a direct transfer from mom to mom to mom, right? You can actually trace your matriarch, your matriarchal lineage, right? And we can even tell you how long your ancestors have been out of East Africa, right? It's a pretty neat piece of genetic evidence, right? Now, what else? What else would a cell need? All cells have what? Four things. The membrane. Do mitochondria and chloroplasts have membranes? Yep. They all have to have a cytoplasm. They both have cytoplasm. In the chloroplast, we call it the stroma. And inside of the mitochondria, we call it the matrix. All cells have DNA. We already checked that off our list. What's also really crazy at mitochondrial and chloroplastic DNA is they're circular, like bacteria, like prokaryotes. And what else? What is that fourth thing all cells have? What for protein synthesis? Ribosomes. And the type of ribosomes in the mitochondria, the type of ribosomes in the chloroplast match prokaryotes. They're unlike our normal eukaryotic ribosomes. So that tells us, okay, wow, our mitochondria, our chloroplast might just be an ancient bacteria that's hitching a ride, right? It gives us ATP, and what do we give it? Pyruvic acid, right? So it's kind of a neat little thing to think about. All right, sorry, I get excited about that. 6, what large organelle stores water and helps maintain internal pressure inside of a plant cell wall? The central vacuole. I think vacuum sucks up all the water, and it applies what is known as Turgor pressure to the inside of the cell wall, right? Keeps the cell wall nice and rigid. Some scientists refer to Turgor pressure as hydrostatic pressure. Hydro meaning water, static meaning constant. Now, you've already known this all along, because you know that if you don't water a plant, or a plant goes a long period of time without water, what happens? It'll shrivel up and then it'll wilt, right? It's kind of like collapsing in on itself. Then you water the plant, what happens? Clumps back up and then stands back up, right? And that's the vacuole filling with water. The vacuole drains, right? Takes away some of that pressure, the plant falls over, you give it water, plant stands back up, right? If you have any succulents or cacti, it's pretty easy to see the change in pressure when you have a cactus that hasn't had water in a while and a cactus that you just watered, right? The Turgor pressure is substantial, which would tell us that the vacuole inside of a cactus is large, and that would make sense. Number 7, cells associated with the endocrine system are responsible for secreting hormones, right? And so what organelle would aid in packaging and shipping all these hormones out of the cell? Yeah, the Golgi. And how I remember this, I think Golgi, it's always on the go because it's always packing and shipping things, right? It makes me think of the UPS guys and gals, right? I mean, they're driving, they hop out, and 30 seconds later, they're running up the stairs, dropping off the package, back in the truck, off to deliver something else. So I think Golgi, it's constantly on the go, it's shipping things, right? And so our secretory cells, cells that secrete things, a lot of our glands are going to have a substantial amount of Golgi, right? Because we're going to be packaging and shipping things out. 8, cells that produce many lipid compounds and aid in detoxification rely on a proper functioning what? There's 2 endoplasmic reticuli. And so which one is responsible for assembling lipids? smooth, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. Now, how do I remember that? I always come up with something weird. I think smooth like Buddha's belly, right? And so the big statues of Buddha with his big old round belly. Why is Buddha's belly big and round and smooth? Because he's fat, and fats are what kind of biomolecule? Lipids. I don't know why that worked for me, right? I think smooth ER, I think of Buddha's belly, it reminds me of fat. I think fats, I think lipids. I'm like, oh yeah, the assembly line for lipids, right? And so cells that make lipid hormones, right? Can you give me an example of a steroid hormone, which would be a lipid hormone? They determine our secondary sex characteristics. As a man, I have a higher level of testosterone and estrogen, right? And so the testes and the ovaries are going to have a lot of smooth endoplasmic reticulum because they're synthesizing and assembling these steroid lipid hormones. And they're also going to have Golgi, right? Because the testes and the ovaries are going to secrete those, right? And so, as a medical doctor, if your patient, right, had low levels of testosterone or low levels of estrogen when they should have higher levels, maybe during their adolescent developments, there might be a problem with what cells? The testes and the ovaries, right? If they're not producing, synthesizing, and shipping those hormones, that would be where I would look, right? What about the rough ER? What does the rough ER do? It doesn't assemble lipids, it assembles what? Anyone remember? Proteins. It doesn't synthesize proteins. That's the job of the what? The ribosome. The rough ER assembles and finishes the folding. And that sounds kind of weird, but think about it. If you bought a piece of furniture from IKEA and you assembled it, do you tell someone that you made that piece of furniture? I hope you don't, right? You assembled it, you bought it, and you finished putting it together. And so that's what the rough ER does. Why do we call it the rough ER? Well, because embedded in that endoplasmic reticulum, there are ribosomes. They're like kind of stuck in the little membranes, right? And so ribosomes synthesize the proteins and release them into the rough ER lumen, which is just like kind of empty space. And then they finish assembling or folding, okay? So the rough ER would be something you would find in maybe the alpha or beta cells of the pancreas, okay? And what hormones do our pancreases release? Helps lower blood sugar. Starts with an I. Insulin. And does anyone remember the really neat one that causes your blood sugar to rise? Glucagon, right? So glucagon and insulin are both peptide hormones, both protein hormones that are made in the pancreas. And so if your pancreatic function was compromised, it might be a problem with your rough ER, right? Not finishing the assembly of either insulin or glucagon. All right, last one, 9. Many cells of the human immune system are capable of engulfing and digesting pathogens inside of their cells. What organelle contains the hydrolytic enzymes that would aid in this intracellular digestion? Kind of sad. It reminds me of cleaning, and I think of these as the cleanup crew. You'd spray this on a counter to wipe it down. Lysol. The lysosome, yeah. So that's just the way that I remember. I think lysosome is like the cleanup crew, right? In the same way that I would clean with Lysol, the lysosome contains very powerful enzymes. So if a macrophage, which simply means like big eater, right? A macrophage were to endosynthesize or engulf, swallow a bacteria or a virus, right? It would make what is known as a phagosome or phagosome, and that just means like a body as a result of the cell eating. And then the lysosome would bind to it, and it would release these hydrolytic enzymes, right? And that would digest the things intracellular. What's also kind of neat about lysosomes is we sometimes call them the suicide sac, because our cells have the ability to perform something known as apoptosis. And an easy way to remember that in my mind, I say like make a onomatopoeia, like a pop sound, apoptosis. It's our cells' way of ending their own existence. And they do this using the lysosome, right? The lysosome would be pre-programmed to help the cell self-terminate. Now, I know it's kind of an off-the-wall question, but why in the world would you want your cells to be able to self-terminate? What was that? Would you want your organs to just like continuously and never stop growing? No, right? Sometimes they'll get pushed up against each other and cells are going to be like, all right, I'm not necessary anymore. Or think about maybe you used to be heavy and now you're not. You would hope that your body has the ability to do what with fat cells after you've lost that weight? To get rid of them, right? You wouldn't want those fat cells hanging around if you no longer needed that place for triglycerides. So apoptosis is programmed cell death. And that's actually one of the major problems with cancer, right? Cancer kills us because the cancer cells, they either starve our bodies or they take over space, right? If you had a brain tumor, a cancerous tumor in your brain, what's the problem? The tumor is not going to stop growing, and it's going to put a lot of pressure against what? Your brain, right? And in the same way that if you fell asleep on your arm, you put so much pressures on those cells, you kind of cut off the blood supply, don't you? It's that tumor growing inside of your skull puts a lot of pressure on those cells and cut off the blood supply or cause a lot of problems with cell transport. In fact, there's a local oncologist that has agreed to do a little live Q&A session with you guys. So when we do talk about cancer, he'll join our Zoom and you guys can throw all kinds of questions at him about cancer, right? Because I think 1 out of every 4 women in this room, you guys will get cancer. No, sorry, 1 out of every 5. Gentlemen, 1 out of 4 of us. So there are currently, what, 5 guys in here? Yeah, so one of us is most definitely going to get cancer of some form. So I think it's important that we understand it, right? Because it's something we all have in common. All right, so for those of you guys at home, what I would like for you guys to do right now is make sure that you start working on 4.2, the vocab, the article, and the videos. All right, don't wait on those because remember Thursday and Friday we're going to be very busy in the garden and with our microscope labs. So if you don't have any questions, you can go ahead and hit the road. And I will also have study guides for you guys for the quiz. So tomorrow I'll give you guys your copy, virtual learners. I'll send you guys a copy of that as well, and I'll hand that to you guys here in just a second. So if you guys want to go ahead and sign off the Zoom.